It all started when my husband Jake and I moved into our new home in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Richmond, Virginia. The area seemed perfect: nice houses, friendly neighbors, and a good school district for our two kids, Lucy and Ethan, who were 5 and 7 at the time. We had big plans for this house: a backyard for the kids to play in, space to grow our family, and a place to call home for years to come. But something dark lurked next door that would soon shatter all of our expectations. Our next-door neighbor, Mr. Garrison, was a man in his late 40s, living alone in a house that looked as if it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. He wasn't particularly friendly, but he also wasn't openly hostile. The few times we exchanged greetings, his responses were curt, and his demeanor left us both with an uneasy feeling. Jake often joked about the man being a bit off, but we didn't pay it too much attention at first. One evening, a few months after moving in, I was in the backyard watching Lucy and Ethan play on their swing set. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the yard, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I looked up and saw Mr. Garrison standing at one of his upstairs windows, staring directly at the kids. His face was expressionless, but the intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. I quickly ushered the kids inside, trying not to make a big deal of it. That night, I told Jake about the incident. He shrugged it off, saying Mr. Garrison was probably just curious, or maybe lonely. "You know how some people are," he said, brushing off my concerns. But I couldn't shake the image of Mr. Garrison's cold stare from my mind. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing him more and more. Every time the kids were outside playing, he'd be there, either at his window or sometimes even standing at the edge of his yard, just watching. I tried to ignore it, but it became harder as time went on. It wasn't just the staring. There was something about the way he lingered, how his eyes would lock onto the kids as if he was studying them. I made sure to keep them inside more often after that, but it was becoming clear that something wasn't right. One Saturday evening, Jake and I decided to host a small barbecue with a few friends. The kids were playing in the yard while the adults gathered around the grill, enjoying the warm summer evening. That's when it happened. Lucy came running over to me, her face pale and frightened. "Mommy, the man next door said he wants to take pictures of us," she blurted out. My heart dropped into my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "He was at the fence," she said, pointing toward Mr. Garrison's yard. "He asked if we could come closer so he could take a picture of us." I immediately told Jake, who stormed over to the fence. Mr. Garrison was standing just a few feet away, hands in his pockets, with that same vacant expression on his face. Jake demanded to know what he had said to Lucy, but Garrison just smiled slightly and muttered something under his breath before walking back into his house. We were both livid, but without any solid proof of wrongdoing. What could we do? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Lucy's words in my head, the eerie way Garrison had smiled, the unsettling feeling that had been growing inside me since the day we moved in. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it, a faint noise like the creak of a gate. My heart started racing. I nudged Jake awake and told him what I heard. He groggily got up and went to check it out. A minute later, I heard him cursing under his breath from downstairs. When he came back up, his face was pale. "The side gate was open," he said. "I don't know how, but someone opened it." The next morning, I called the police and reported the incident, but without any evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested we install security cameras, which we did immediately. I wanted to feel safe in my own home again, but the cameras only ended up capturing more of Garrison's disturbing behavior. Several times a week, we would see him lurking near the fence, staring at our house. Sometimes he would walk around the perimeter of his yard late at night, always keeping his eyes on our property. It was like he was waiting for something, watching for the right moment. Then, one night, things escalated. It was around 11 p.m., and the kids were already in bed. Jake and I were watching TV in the living room when we heard the sound of glass shattering from upstairs. We both jumped up and ran to check on the kids. Lucy's bedroom window had been smashed, and there, lying on the floor, was a small rock with a note tied to it. My hands trembled as I opened the note, which read, "Your kids are beautiful." I felt like I was going to be sick. Jake called the police immediately. and when they arrived, we showed them the footage from our security cameras. The grainy footage clearly showed Mr. Garrison sneaking around the side of our house just moments before the window was broken. This time, the police took it seriously. They went to his house to question him, but he denied everything, claiming he was asleep at the time. A restraining order was issued, but it didn't stop the fear that had taken root inside me. Every night I would lie awake, listening for any sound, any sign that Garrison was still out there, watching. And then one night, the silence broke. It was 3 a.m. when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps inside our house. My blood ran cold. I shook Jake awake, whispering that someone was inside. He grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed, and we crept downstairs together. As we reached the bottom step, we saw him, Mr. Garrison, standing in our living room, holding a camera. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at us like we were animals in a zoo. Jake lunged at him, but Garrison bolted out the back door before he could reach him. We called the police, and this time, they arrested him. We later found out that he had been sneaking into our house through the basement window for weeks, taking pictures of the kids while they slept. We moved out of that house the next day. I still get chills thinking about how long he had been watching us, waiting for his chance. The nightmare ended, but the fear still lingers. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, the eyes of a predator who almost took everything from us. When Rachel and Matt first moved into their cozy new house in Portland, Oregon, they couldn't believe their luck. The house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by towering pines and friendly neighbors who all seemed eager to welcome them to the area. It was their dream home. 3 bedrooms, a spacious backyard, and a front porch perfect for lazy weekend mornings with coffee. Everything felt perfect in the beginning. Rachel worked from home, managing marketing for a small startup, while Matt commuted to his office downtown. The routine was easy, and the peaceful neighborhood provided the exact respite they needed from the hustle and bustle of city life. But as the weeks passed, Rachel began to feel a strange sense of unease, like something wasn't quite right. It started innocently enough. One afternoon, as she sat in her home office, Rachel glanced out the window that overlooked the street and saw a man standing in his yard across the road. He was just standing there, staring directly at her house. At first, she thought nothing of it. Perhaps he was just zoning out or enjoying the view. She gave him a polite wave, but he didn't wave back. Instead, he turned and walked back into his house, leaving Rachel with a slight chill running down her spine. Later that evening, Rachel mentioned it to Matt while they cooked dinner together. "I saw the neighbor across the street today. He was just standing there staring at the house," she said, trying to sound casual. Matt shrugged. "Maybe he's just a little weird. Every neighborhood has one, right?" Rachel laughed it off, telling herself it was no big deal. But over the next few days, she noticed the same man again and again. Sometimes he'd be sitting on his front porch, his eyes fixed on her. Other times she'd catch glimpses of him through the window, just standing in his driveway. He never did anything overtly threatening, but the way he watched her made her skin crawl. A week later, as Rachel was watering the plants in the front yard, she saw him again, this time much closer. He was standing at the edge of her property line, just staring. She froze for a moment, gripping the hose tightly in her hand. "Hi," she called out, forcing a smile. "Can I help you with something?" The man, probably in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and a potbelly, didn't respond at first. His expression was blank, and his eyes seemed to bore into her as if she were an object, not a person. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he finally said in a monotone voice. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, leaving Rachel standing there with her heart pounding in her chest. Something about the interaction felt deeply unsettling. That night, she told Matt about the encounter. "I don't know, babe. Maybe he's just socially awkward," Matt suggested, trying to reassure her. "I'll keep an eye out, but unless he does something more, it's probably nothing." Rachel wanted to believe him, but the feeling of being watched lingered. A few nights later, things escalated. Matt was working late, and Rachel was home alone. It was around 9 p.m., and she had just settled on the couch with a glass of wine and a book when she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the back of the house. She paused, listening carefully. There it was again, soft, deliberate tapping on the kitchen window. Her heart raced as she tiptoed toward the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She turned the corner and froze. Through the window, illuminated by the faint glow of the porch light, she saw the silhouette of a man standing just outside. He was close, too close. His face was obscured by shadows, but she knew it was him, the neighbor. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, trying to decide whether to confront him or call the police. Before she could move again, he suddenly turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. When Matt came home later that night, Rachel was still shaken. "I swear to God, Matt, he was right there outside the window, just standing there, watching me," she said, her voice trembling. Matt's face darkened. "That's it. I'm talking to him tomorrow." The next day, Matt did just that. He knocked on the neighbor's door, determined to put an end to the creepy behavior. The man answered, his face as blank as ever. "Is there something going on between you and my wife?" Matt demanded, his tone firm but calm. "She says you've been watching her. It needs to stop." The neighbor blinked, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied flatly. "I keep to myself." Matt wasn't convinced, but without any hard proof, there wasn't much he could do. After a tense silence, he left, feeling uneasy. For a few days, things seemed to quiet down. The neighbor kept his distance, and Rachel started to feel like maybe the confrontation had worked. But her sense of relief was short-lived. One evening, Rachel was sitting on the front porch, enjoying the cool breeze, when her phone buzzed with a notification from the security camera they'd installed a few weeks earlier. Curious, she opened the app to check the footage. What she saw made her stomach drop. There, in the middle of the night, was the neighbor. The footage showed him creeping around the side of their house, stopping to peer into the windows. He moved slowly, methodically, as if he were looking for something, or someone. Rachel felt sick as she watched him circle the house, his face never fully visible, but his presence unmistakable. She showed the footage to Matt as soon as he got home. "That's it. We're calling the cops," he said, his voice tight with anger. They filed a report, but when the police arrived to question the neighbor, he denied everything. He claimed he had no idea what they were talking about and suggested that maybe the camera had picked up someone else. Without concrete evidence beyond the grainy footage, the police couldn't do much more than issue a warning, but the damage was done. Rachel no longer felt safe in her own home. Every night she double-checked the locks, peeking through the curtains to make sure the neighbor wasn't lurking outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, waiting. Then, one night, her worst fears were confirmed. Matt had gone out of town for a work trip, leaving Rachel home alone. She tried to stay calm, telling herself that she was being paranoid, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that had settled in the pit of her stomach. It was late, around midnight, when she heard the sound of footsteps outside. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone and opened the security camera app. The feed was blurry in the darkness, but she could make out a figure moving toward the back of the house. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She quietly slipped into the kitchen, her hands trembling as she locked the back door. The footsteps grew louder, and she could see the shadow of the man standing just outside the door. Then, suddenly, the doorknob jiggled. He was trying to get in. Rachel's heart pounded in her ears as she frantically dialed 911. She whispered into the phone, telling the operator what was happening. The seconds felt like hours as she waited for the police to arrive. Finally, she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The man outside must have heard them too because he bolted, disappearing into the night. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no sign of the neighbor. However, they did find something else: handprints on the windows and smudges on the back door where the man had tried to break in. Rachel and Matt moved out of that house a few weeks later. They never saw the neighbor again, but the memory of his cold, watchful eyes still haunts Rachel. She knows that if they had stayed, he would have kept watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "3 months ago, my boyfriend Kyle and I moved into a small apartment complex in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Boston. It was perfect for us, affordable, close to campus for my classes, and in a friendly, student-heavy area. The building itself was old but charming, with creaky hardwood floors and large windows that let in the morning light. We were both excited to start this new chapter, and everything seemed perfect, at first. Our apartment faced a narrow alley that separated us from the neighboring building. Like many older complexes, the windows faced out into the corridors, meaning anyone walking by could easily glance into your room. It was a bit unnerving at first, but I figured we'd get used to it. After all, we were surrounded by other students, and the area felt safe. The first time I noticed something odd was late one evening. I had just gotten back from a long day of classes, and Kyle was working late at his part-time job. As I settled onto the couch with a textbook, I heard faint footsteps outside the window. I glanced up and saw a man walking past, which wasn't unusual. People walked by all the time. But something about him felt off. He wasn't hurrying like most people do when they're heading to their apartment. Instead, he seemed to slow down as he approached our window. I quickly turned my attention back to my book, pretending I hadn't noticed. The next morning, I asked Kyle if he'd seen the man before, but he shrugged it off. "Probably just another neighbor," he said. "This place is full of students, so I wouldn't worry about it." I tried to let it go, but over the next few weeks, I kept seeing the same man. He was always alone, always quiet, and always walking by our window. Sometimes I'd catch him standing just outside, seemingly staring in, though he'd move away quickly if I happened to glance up. It creeped me out, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. One evening, Kyle was working late again, and I was getting ready for bed when I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint tapping sound against the window. But as I listened closer, it became clear. Someone was knocking, ever so softly, as if testing to see if I would notice. My heart raced, and I froze in place. The tapping stopped for a moment, and then I heard it again, this time louder. I tiptoed to the window and peeked through the blinds. There he was, the man who had been walking by all these weeks. He was standing directly outside, his hand raised as if ready to knock again. His face was mostly hidden by the shadows, but I could see enough to know he wasn't just another neighbor passing by. He was waiting, watching. I stepped back from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone and texted Kyle, telling him someone was outside, but there was no response. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? The man hadn't done anything yet. An hour later, Kyle finally came home. I told him about the man, about the knocking, about everything. He frowned, but like before, he didn't seem too concerned. "I'll keep an eye out," he said, trying to reassure me. "Maybe he's just a harmless weirdo." The next few days were quiet. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. But one night, everything changed. Kyle had gone out with friends, leaving me alone in the apartment. I had planned to spend the evening catching up on schoolwork, but around 10 p.m., I heard footsteps outside the window again. I tensed up, hoping it was just someone heading home after a night out. But the footsteps stopped, right in front of our window. I stood still, listening. And then, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. The tapping grew louder, more forceful. It wasn't just a knock anymore. It was as if someone was trying to get inside. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. As I spoke to the operator, I glanced out the window just in time to see the man press his face up against the glass. His eyes were wide, his expression blank, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he stared, as if he were looking straight through me. I rushed to the front door and locked it, my entire body trembling. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours. The tapping continued, and I could hear the man muttering something under his breath, though I couldn't make out the words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. The tapping stopped abruptly, and I heard the man's footsteps retreating down the alley. By the time the police arrived, he was long gone. The officers took my statement and promised to patrol the area more frequently, but they didn't seem optimistic about catching the man. "He's probably just some guy who's a little too curious," one of them said, "but we'll keep an eye out." That night, Kyle and I agreed it was time to move. We couldn't stay in a place where I didn't feel safe, where a stranger could stand outside my window and watch me without consequence. It's been a month since we moved out, and I haven't seen the man since. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a faint tapping sound in my dreams, and I'll remember the way he stood there, watching, waiting. And I wonder if he's found someone else to watch.